As you may know if you've been around the channel for a while, I like to dabble in making videos about localization and its many problems. Well, one side effect of this is that I sometimes get people in my comments saying that I'm wrong for telling people to, say, stop defending bad localization, or that I shouldn't nitpick a game's script, or that my proposed alternatives aren't as good as the over-localized quote-unquote originals. And while it is somewhat frustrating to have to read comments like these over and over again, it is also a rather interesting experience for me as well. Why is it interesting, I hear you ask? Well, that's because I get to witness firsthand people who are victims of what I've come to call the localization dilemma. I've alluded to this phenomenon on a number of occasions in various videos and replies, but I've never taken the time to lay out what it actually is and the implications that it has for you guys, so that's exactly what we are going to do today. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to say that I will be referring specifically to games in this video, but anything I say can be applied to any other localized piece of media, be it a movie, a TV show, a book, what have you. So, to start off here, let's draw an extremely simple diagram that depicts the localization dilemma. At the top, we have a box that will represent a game in its original unlocalized form. Now let's say we want to take that original game and bring it over to another region where the language is different. In doing this, we will have to make a decision to go in one of two general directions. On one side, we have the decision to make a localized version of the game that is as faithful to the original as possible, meaning changes are only made when absolutely necessary, and on the other, we have the decision to over-localize a game, changing things based not only on necessity, but opinion as well. Like I said, this diagram represents an extremely simplified version of this process, but for the purposes of this video, we don't really need to get into the minutia here. Now, let's say that a company or localization team decides they want to go the over-localization route with the game they're responsible for, or in terms of this diagram, they've chosen the route on the right side. In accordance with this route, the localization team has more freedom to use their own discretion when making changes, and can even add their own flair to the script if they so choose. The team goes about localizing the game in this way from start to finish, and eventually it comes time to release the game in their region. From the perspective of a localizer, this is where their involvement with a game ends and they move on to their next project. However, from a consumer point of view, this is where the implications of the decision made by the company or team of localizers, all the way back before they even began localizing the game, start to take form. What do I mean by this? Well, once a game is released, fans play the game, form an opinion on it based on what they are presented with, and then hold that opinion for years to come. This is the root of the problem with the localization dilemma. An opinion once formed is extremely difficult to alter, let alone remake entirely, so the opinions of players when it comes to a specific game tend to hold true for many, many years, possibly never changing at all. This means that the fans who enjoyed their time with an over-localized game will tend to stick with the belief that the localized form of the game is best, even if they have no idea what the original game is like. This way of thinking was essentially harmless a few decades ago when the average person didn't have access to vast amounts of information about every game both in original and localized form at their fingertips. However, as we all know, the same can't be said for the modern day. Nowadays, the likelihood that one of these localized game enthusiasts will come across someone like me who points out the many changes and inconsistencies in the localizations of their favorite games is quite high. And as those of us that have interacted with someone like this on the topic of localization can most likely attest, these interactions tend to go very badly. No matter how many times you say things like, defending bad localization only makes game localizations worse, or even the smallest localization change can have devastating repercussions later on, or making unnecessary changes to a game and then selling it as if it were the same as the original game is deceptive towards the consumer, none of it seems to reach their ears. You'll more likely than not just get a reply akin to, well, I like localized games, so there's nothing wrong with them. Personally, I've received a response like this on several different occasions upon replying to comments, and every time I read something like this, my mind is blown. The fact that someone could really think that simply presenting a purely subjective opinion with no factual evidence or compelling arguments to back up their stance that games should continue to be over-localized is crazy to me. Now, I'm not going to say there aren't any arguments to be made here at all, but at the very least, I have never heard a single one, especially one that I consider compelling. The vast majority of responses I've received, as well as the ones I've seen on sites like Twitter and Reddit, typically boil down to, I like localized games, so localization good. The saddest part about this is that the fan bases of many localized games are comprised of a large portion of people that think this way. Like I said before, the reason being that the only game English-speaking Western fans can play is the localized form of the game, which therefore becomes their sole point of reference for the series. Let's use Fire Emblem as an example, since that's been a rather hot-button issue as of late. The Western Fire Emblem fanbase is largely comprised of people who actually enjoy the neutered version of the game they're presented with by Nintendo of America, so showing these people things like the skinship minigame, some of the more politically incorrect Japanese lines, or some of the removed romantic relationships will typically prompt a response of disgust or disdain for the original game. And I mean, you can't really blame them, right? After all, they're not fans of Fire Emblem. They're fans of the Western version of Fire Emblem. They're not fans of the development teams at Nintendo of Japan and Intelligent Systems. They're fans of the localization team at Nintendo of America. This inherent disconnect between the fan bases of localized games is the biggest issue caused by the localization dilemma that every company must face when deciding to bring a game to a new region. If you make the conscious decision to localize a game more than is warranted by the text, this disconnect and general infighting among fans is an inevitability. And with such a divisive and complicated problem, there couldn't possibly be a simple solution, right? Well, as it turns out, there is. All you have to do as a company or localization team is choose to take the left path on our little diagram here and make a localized game that is as faithful to the original game as possible. Now, I can already hear the hurried fingers of localization lovers on their keyboards as they type, "You only want them to make a faithful localization because you like faithful localizations." But that's only partly true. While I do prefer faithful localizations above all else, my reasoning here is not based solely on subjective opinion. The main reason the decision to go with a faithful localization solves the localization dilemma is that if a game is localized to be as close to the original as possible, then the player's opinions of that game will be based solely on what the game truly is at its most fundamental level. The conversations amongst the player base will shift from the validity of changing dialogue, censoring outfits, removing characterization, or altering names to the actual merits of the game, like the dialogue itself, the art direction, the music, or the combat. And before you say it, yes, I understand that you may not like this new, more faithful version of your favorite game, but that simply means that you never liked it to begin with, and that's okay. You don't have to hold these foreign series hostage from the rest of the fanbase and the world because you don't want to face the fact that you've been living in a fairyland cooked up by English localizers for the past 20 years. In my opinion, any attempt at preserving the standard of massively over-localized games is nothing more than a selfish attempt at averting one's eyes from what these games truly are. Now, do I honestly think I'll be able to convince any of these adherents to over-localization that they should embrace faithful localization with this video? As I said before, absolutely not. They'll probably just comment something like, "I like Fire Emblem, so they shouldn't change it," and then move on with their day, thus proving my point that opinions once formed aren't easily changed. The real point of this video was simply to illustrate the dilemma that causes these people to exist as they are in the first place, as well as to show you how simple the solution is to all the problems brought on by this dilemma. Hopefully I was able to accomplish that, but seeing as this is a concept that I thought up, I may not have done the best job explaining things, so let me know if you have any questions or additions you'd like to make to my little theorem here. I'll be glad to respond to anything that's not, "I like localized games, so you're wrong." But other than that, if you happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like and subbing if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Back out.